He sold my wedding dress for $100. $100! The gown I wore when I thought love meant forever, sold on Facebook Marketplace to a stranger who said she'd do something creative with the fabric. And when I found out, when I stood there with my hands trembling and the empty space in the closet gaping like a wound, I asked him what he did with his record collection, the ones he swore he'd never part with. He said he sold them too, for $1, the whole lot. I laughed then, a sharp, broken sound that didn't belong in my throat. Because that was the moment I realized we were both trying to erase each other, one transaction at a time. It hadn't started that way. Once, our house was full of laughter, full of half-finished songs, and the scent of coffee and rain-soaked mornings. His name was Jamie, and he'd always had this way of making everything feel like it was part of a movie scene. He'd wake me up playing Fleetwood Mac to loud, dancing around the kitchen in his threadbare t-shirt, holding out a mug of coffee like it was an offering. For the Queen of Bad Dreams, he'd say, grinning. And I'd roll my eyes but smile. Anyway, because it was impossible not to. Back then, the vinyls were sacred. He'd spent years collecting them, each one carefully sleeved, labeled in his meticulous handwriting. He'd talk about them like old friends. You can tell everything about a person by the scratches on their records, he'd tell me. It's the story of how they listen, and I believed him the way I believed. Everything, he said. Because back then, I wanted to be one of those stories he'd never stop listening to. We'd met in a thrift store. Ironically enough, I was looking for an old mirror. He was flipping through the dusty crates of vinyls in the back. He had that half-smile people when they're lost but pretending they're not. You can tell a lot about someone by the first record they pick. Up, he said without looking at me. Is that so? I'd replied, picking up a Bowie album just to challenge him. He looked at the cover, then at me, and said, "Your trouble, it should have been a warning." 3 years later, I stood in that same thrift store again, this time alone, this time holding the same Bowie record. I didn't buy it. I just held it for a while, wondering when everything had shifted, when the laughter had turned to silence, when the silences had turned to cracks we couldn't plaster over. It started small. The late nights, the missed calls, the moments where I'd find him staring at the wall like he was waiting for someone else to show up. Then came the arguments, quiet at first, then loud, then cruel. We fought about money, about time, about nothing and everything. "You don't look at me the same," he said once. "Because you're not the same," I'd whispered back. That was the truth neither of us wanted to admit. We'd both changed, just in ways that didn't fit together anymore. I remember the day the dress went up, for sale. It was a Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through job listings, when I saw the photo, my photo. The dress draped over the same wooden chair he used to sit in. The caption read, "Asterisk used once. Needs a new story. Asterisk the price, $100. I thought it was a joke. I called him. He didn't pick up. When he finally came home, I didn't ask, I just showed him the post. He didn't even look surprised. "It was taking up space," he said. "You weren't ever going to wear it again." I wanted to scream, too. Throw something. To hurt him the way he did you, but instead just stared and said, "And what about your records?" He hesitated then, and for the first time, I saw something like regret flicker across his face. "I sold them," he said. "All of them. Guy came by this morning. Gave me $1, $1. He shrugged. They were just collecting dust, but that wasn't true. Nothing in our house was ever asterisk, just asterisk collecting dust. Every record, every book, every chipped mug had a story. They were the ghosts of us. Selling them wasn't about space, it was about erasure. It was about making sure the next time someone walked in, there'd be no trace of the people we used to be. That night, I went through what was left. The drawers, the boxes under the bed, the old photo albums. He sat in the living room, silent, nursing a beer like it was the only thing holding him together. When I found the wedding invitation tucked behind a stack of unpaid bills, I tore it in half and dropped it in his lap. "You win," I said. He looked up, eyes glassy. "This isn't a game, Mia. Everything's a game with you," I said. "You just hate losing." We didn't talk after that, not for days. The air between us became a kind of static cloud enough to fill the silence. Soft enough to make you think you could still breathe through it. Then, one morning, I woke up and he was gone. No note. No message. Just the sound of emptiness humming through the walls. Premier fund. The house keys on the counter, beside a scrap of paper with a single line written on it. Asterisk, you can't sell memories. Asterisk, I laughed until I cried. Because he was wrong. That's exactly what we'd both been doing, trying to sell the pieces of our past to anyone who'd take them. Hoping that by giving them away, we could buy ourselves a little peace. But peace doesn't come cheap. And the strangest part? Sometimes I still hear the faint crackle of a record spinning in the dark, like a ghost of the life we once played to loud. To last, I didn't touch the closet for weeks after. He left. There was no point. The space where my dress had hung still smelled faintly of lavender, sachets and dust. A scent, so stubborn it felt like it was clinging to me, refusing to let go. I tried filling the space with other things, an old coat, a folded blanket. Anything but, every time I opened the door, all I saw was what wasn't there. The house didn't sound the same. Anymore, either. It was too quiet. No scratch of needle on vinyl, no clink of glass on counter, no half-muttered lyrics from the kitchen. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of wood when the wind pressed against the windows. I'd find myself listening for him at night, waiting for the jingle of his keys, the soft thud of his boots on the floor butt. The only footsteps were mine, and they echoed. It was strange how grief moved in, not all at once, but slowly, stealthily. At first, I thought it was anger. I told myself I hated him. I told myself he'd ruined everything. But then I'd catch myself scrolling through his old playlists, stopping at songs that once made us dance in the living room at 2 a.m. I'd press play, and suddenly I was back there, barefoot and dizzy, his arms around me, the world spinning softly. That's when I realized anger was just the shell. Inside it was something heavier, regret, maybe, or love, but warped and bruised. One evening, after a rainstorm, I drove to the thrift shop where we'd met. I hadn't planned to. I just ended up there, like my car. Had made the decision for me. The bell over the door gave a sad little jingle when I walked in. Everything looked smaller, somehow. Maybe it was me, who'd grown, larger, filled with too much ache to fit inside the same spaces. The old man behind the counter didn't recognize me. He asked if I was looking for anything in particular, and I almost said asterisk, yes, my husband asterisk, but instead I sighed. Records. He pointed to the back, where the same old crate sat waiting. I ran, my fingers along the dusty sleeves, letting the names pass through. Me like memories, Hendrix, Cohen, Joni, Cash. Then my hand froze. There it was, the Bowie album. The same one from that first day. The same one that had started everything. Someone had written a price in the corner, in faint pencil. $1. I stared at it for a long time, then bought it without saying a word. The old man didn't even look up as he rang it up. "Et je," handed me the record, wrapped in a brown paper sleeve, and said, "Music always finds its way home." When I got back to the car, I set the record on the passenger seat. I hadn't even brought a turntable I'd sold that months ago when money got tight, but I didn't need to play it. Just holding it felt like holding something alive again. That night, I made myself a drink, sat on the floor of the living room, and stared at the empty shelves where his records used to be. I tried to imagine him, somewhere else, maybe another apartment, another city. Maybe with someone new who didn't know how loud he snored, or how he always burned the toast. I thought about his note again. Asterisk, you can't sell memories. Asterisk, maybe he'd meant it as a kindness. Maybe it was an apology disguised as truth. Week later, I got a message from an unknown number. Asterisk, you still have that Bowie record. Asterisk, I didn't need to ask who it was. Asterisk, yeah. Asterisk, I typed back. Asterisk, why? Asterisk, asterisk, because I bought it too. Asterisk, I frowned. Asterisk, what do you mean? Asterisk, asterisk, there were 2 copies. One was yours, one was mine. I guess the universe didn't want to separate them. Asterisk, for a moment, I just stared at the screen. Then, before I could stop myself, I typed, asterisk, you still think the universe cares about us? Asterisk, his reply came almost instantly. Asterisk, not about us. About timing. Asterisk, I didn't respond after that. What was there to say? Timing had always been our enemy. Too early, too late, never quite right. But that night, as I sat there with the record between my hands, I realized something I hadn't before. Maybe we'd both sold the wrong things. Maybe we wanted and needed to go there. Maybe it was the stories we'd told ourselves about what love was supposed to look like. I picked up my phone again, opened Facebook marketing, wedding dress. Used once, needs a new story, asterisk, but this time I didn't post it. I just saved it as a draft and closed the app. Because maybe, just maybe, it wasn't ready to be sold. And neither was I the next morning. I drove out of town. No plan, no destination, just the open road and an old record. Riding shotgun. Somewhere between the fading city skyline and the first stretch of countryside. I rolled down the windows and let the wind take the last of the lavender scent from my hair. I whispered to no one, here's to timing, and for the first time in a long while, it didn't sound like goodbye. The road unfurled before me like an unedited confession raw, endless and full of places I didn't yet. No, I needed to see. It was early morning, and the sky still wore the bruises of dawn. The radio barely worked, fading in and out with static. So I played the Bowie record in my head, letting every lyric rebuild a part of me I'd let fall apart. Somewhere outside of town, I stopped for gas. A small station, the kind that looked like it had been there since the 70s cracked. Concrete, faded signage, a Coke machine that buzzed like it was alive. Inside, a girl behind the counter with purple hair and a chipped smile rang me up. She looked at the record on the passenger seat when I went to pay and said, nice choice. That one's rare now. I didn't know what to say, so I just smiled. Yeah, it used to mean something. She tilted her head, studying me. Everything used to mean something, she said softly. Doesn't mean it can't again. I left her a tip I couldn't afford and got back on the road, the words echoing like an omen. Maybe she was right. Maybe meaning wasn't something you lost, it was something you misplaced until you were ready to find it again. Hi, Zay.
Miles stretched out. I found myself thinking less about Jamie and more about the pieces of me that had gone missing in the years we'd been together. I'd been so busy trying to fit into the shape of us that I'd forgotten what me looked like. The music, the painting, the writing things I used to do just because they made me feel alive had all been boxed up and labeled someday. That night, I found a small roadside motel near the coast. The neon sign outside flickered like a dying heartbeat, vacancy blinking in uneven rhythm. Inside, the room smelled faintly of salt and old air conditioning. I turned off the lights and opened the curtains. The ocean was somewhere out there in the dark, whispering secrets to anyone who still believed in forgiveness. I sat on the edge of the bed, the record in my lap. For a while, I just traced the grooves with my fingertips, remembering how he used to hold it like something sacred. I could almost hear his voice, teasing, familiar. You're holding it wrong, Mia, he'd say. Fingerprints are forever. Maybe I want them to be, I'd reply. That memory hit like a ghostly wave, bittersweet and too real. I lay back and stared at the ceiling until the static hum of the world became something softer, something close to peace. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gulls and the faint crash of waves. The air smelled alive, sharp with salt and promise. I got dressed, tucked the record under my arm, and walked until I could see the water. The beach was nearly empty, just a fisherman in the distance and a dog chasing the tide. I stood there, toes buried in the cold sand, watching the horizon bleed light. I thought about everything that had been sold, given away, thrown out, the dress, the records, the...
Years! It wasn't loss that haunted me, it was the idea that we'd made those choices out of spite, not freedom. Like to people setting fire to the same house from opposite sides just to prove they didn't care who got burned. I sat down and pressed the record against my knees. The reflection of the morning sky shimmered faintly on its black surface pink and golden new. I wondered if Jamie ever thought about this, about how love doesn't die, it just changes languages. The wind picked up and I found myself talking out loud. You were wrong, you know, I said to the waves. You can sell memories. You just can't buy them back. For a moment, I swore I heard him laugh and reply, a soft, distant echo carried on the sea air. Oh, mais toi? Just the sound of my own heart breaking in a different key. Later that day, I found a small cafe tucked behind a row of surf shops. It was the kind of place that smelled like burnt espresso and possibility. A chalkboard out front read * trade stories for coffee *. Inside, people sat with notebooks and sketch pads, all trying to write or draw their way out of something. Premier tout casséat. Bis a window. A woman came over with a notebook in her hand and said, "We've got a deal. You tell me a story, your drink's on the house." So I told her about the wedding dress. About the man who sold his vinyls for $1. About how love can turn into currency when you stop knowing what it's worth. She listened without interrupting, just scribbling in her notebook. When premier finished, she tore a page from it and slid it across the table. It said, * some things aren't meant to be kept. They're meant to be remembered. * I looked up and she smiled. You'd be surprised how many people come here to start over, she said. It's kind of our unofficial specialty. When I left, I pinned the note to the dashboard of my car. Every time the wind caught it through the cracked window, it fluttered like it wanted to take flight. That night, as the sun fell behind the ocean, I pulled the dress from the trunk. I brought it with me, though I hadn't meant to. It was still wrapped in its dry-cleaning plastic, a ghost of a day that no longer existed. I built a small fire on the beach. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet flame, small enough to feel personal. I held the dress for a long time before I let it go. When the first threads caught fire, I didn't feel sorrow. I felt release. The silk curled and darkened, the lace turned to ash, and the smoke rose like forgiveness. Somewhere, I imagined him sitting in a small apartment. Maybe holding a record, maybe thinking about me in the same quiet way, maybe not. But either way, the memory was ours again, shared, not sold. When the fire finally died, I sat there in the dark, watching the last ember fade into the sand. And when I finally walked away, I left the record there beside it, still whole, still beautiful. Because some stories deserve an ending that keeps playing even after the sound is gone. The telephone, wires looping endlessly above me. I drove with the windows cracked open, the air cool against my skin, the faint scent of wet earth curling into the car. There was something about it that felt like a baptism. Every mile peeled another layer of my old life away. The Fleetwood Mac record sat on the passenger seat. Beside me, its paper sleeve softening from the humidity. I kept glancing at it like it might speak, like it might tell me where to go next. When the gas light came on, I pulled off the highway into a town called Merivoli, small, quiet, the kind of place where time didn't seem in a hurry. The gas station. Silence that happens when people don't know whether to clap or cry. The host, a man in his 40s with a guitar and kind eyes, looked out into the crowd and said, "Anyone else feel brave tonight?" I don't know what made me raise my hand. Maybe it was the record in my arms, or maybe it was the weight of everything I hadn't said. Whatever it was, it carried me forward until I was standing under the soft light, facing a dozen strangers. I don't have a song, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I have a story. The host nodded and handed me the mic. So premier toltem nodi. Enough! About the dress that sold for $100. About the vinyls that sold for $1. About how sometimes love burns so quietly you don't even notice until the smoke fills your lungs. I didn't cry. I didn't break. I just spoke, and with every word, I felt lighter. When I finished, the crowd was silent, not out of discomfort, but reverence. Then the old man from the cafe, yes, the one who'd been reading the newspaper, stood up and started clapping. The rest followed. Afterward, a few people came up to talk to me. One woman, probably my age, said, "I sold my wedding dress too." For $50. Her laugh was brittle. Guess we all tried to make space for new stories. We sat by the water together, watching the moon ripple across the lake. She told me about her divorce, her son, her plans to move to a new city. I told her about the road, about the fire, about the record that wouldn't stop following me. When she left, she hugged me tightly and said, "Keep driving. Don't stop until it feels like you again." I stayed by the water long after everyone had gone. The night was heavy and quiet, the kind that presses on your chest just to remind you you're still breathing. I set the record down beside me, the moonlight reflecting off its cover like liquid silver. And for a moment, I swore I heard music. Not from the stage or the bar down the road, but from the water itself. Soft, distant, like a heartbeat trying to find its rhythm again. I closed my eyes and whispered, maybe we were heroes, Jamie. Just for one day, the wind stirred, gentle and cool, and for a fleeting second, I could almost believe he heard me. When I opened my eyes, the record was gone. Not washed away this time, not taken, just gone. And somehow, I knew it was right where it belonged. The next morning, when I got back on the road, I didn't take the highway. I chose the smaller roads, the ones without signs or certainty. And for the first time, the space beside me didn't feel empty. It felt open. It felt like freedom. By the time I reached the edge of the mountains, the road had thinned into something wild and winding. Trees pressed close to the asphalt, their branches arching overhead, like ribs protecting a fragile spine. The radio didn't work this far out, just a low hum of static that came and went with the turns. I didn't mind. Silence had stopped feeling like punishment. Somewhere along the ridge, I pulled over at a lookout. Below me, the valley stretched wide and green, a soft ocean of pines and mist. The wind was sharp up there, the kind that smelled clean, like stone and rain. I stood at the edge, feeling the pull of gravity and memory all at once. It was the first time I didn't feel afraid of either. A man with a weathered face and a camera around his neck approached from the trail. "Beautiful, isn't it?" he said. His voice carried a gentleness I wasn't used to. "Yeah," I said. "It doesn't even look real," he smiled, adjusting the lens. "The real things never do." I almost laughed. "You sound like someone who's lost something." "I am," he said simply, "taking a photo." But the trick is learning to see what's left. We stood in silence for a while, the wind tugging at our clothes. "Before I left," he said, Riddles hollow, "there's a record shop there, one of the last ones around a record shop. I hadn't even touched one since that night at the lake. The thought of it made something in me shift, nostalgia, curiosity, maybe both." The shop sat on a corner in the heart of the little town, a crooked sign swinging overhead, needle and groove. The bell above the door jingled when I stepped inside. The air smelled like dust, paper sleeves, and faint traces of incense. Rows of vinyls lined the walls, the kind of organized chaos only true collectors understand. Behind the counter was a man in his 50s, thin, with wire-rimmed glasses, sorting through a stack of records. He looked up when I entered. "Haven't seen you before." "Passing through?" "Something like that," I said. My eyes moved over the racks, drawn by instinct more than interest. "You've got a great collection." He smiled faintly. "Yeah, people keep selling their stories, and I keep buying them back." I froze. The words hit harder than he could have known. I swallowed. "What do you mean?" "Eschrugud. Every record someone sells comes with a little ghost attached to it. You can feel it. The way the vinyl's been handled, the way the cover's worn. People don't realize they're leaving fingerprints on their memories." My heart thudded. "Do you remember all the ones you've bought?" He chuckled. "Not all. But important ones." "Yeah." He turned toward a back shelf, scanning the rows, then pulled something out and handed it to me. "This one's been waiting for someone." I looked down. It was Heroes, the same Bowie album. My throat went dry. "That came in a few weeks ago," he said. "Guy said he'd found it on a beach, of all places. Told me to hold on to it. Said someone would come for it." Eventually, the world seemed to tilt, just slightly. I ran my thumb along the edge of the sleeve, my breath catching when I noticed the faint, salt-stained warping on the cardboard. There was no way. Did he leave a name?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. The man frowned, trying to remember. "Jamie, I think, didn't say much else." Just that this belonged to the right person, not the right time. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My pulse roared in my ears. I wanted to laugh and cry all at once. Of course he'd find it. Of course he'd send it back. That was him always leaving messages in the margins of things. Oh, much? I asked, my voice barely steady. He waved a hand. For something like that? It's already paid for. I carried the record outside and sat on the curb, the sleeve warm under the sunlight. The streets were quiet, except for the hum of a nearby fountain and the sound of cicadas buzzing in the distance. I didn't open it right away. I just held it close, as if it might pulse, with some kind of heartbeat. And then, tucked into the sleeve, I felt something paper. A note, folded small. My hands trembled as I unfolded it. You can't sell memories, it said again. But below that, in smaller handwriting, almost hesitant, but you can set them free. I read it again and again until the words blurred. Then I laughed, quietly, helplessly, because it was so perfectly him, half truth, half apology. That night, I stayed in Riddle's Hollow. There was a small inn above a bakery that smelled like vanilla and warmth. I borrowed a record player from the shop owner and set the vinyl on the turntable. When the needle dropped, the first familiar crackle filled the air. Bowie's voice drifted through the room soft, defiant, eternal. I closed my eyes and listened, not as the woman who'd lost something, but as the one who'd finally let it go. The sound filled the space between the walls, between the years, between us, and for the first time, I didn't ache. I just listened. When the song ended, I lifted the needle, but didn't move the record. I left it spinning, in silence, the label turning under the lamplight like a small planet, forever orbiting a center it no longer needed. Outside, the wind stirred through the open window, and I thought I heard his voice distant, familiar, not haunting anymore, but guiding. Keep the music, it seemed to say. Leave the rest, I whispered back. I will, and I meant it. When morning came, the town was wrapped in fog, soft and weightless. I packed my things, slipped the record into the passenger seat, and started the car. There was still much road ahead. But this time, it didn't feel like escape. It felt like coming home. The fog lingered behind me like a memory, unwilling to fade. But the road ahead was clean silver. And open, the first rays of dawn cutting through the mist. I drove without music for a long while. The silence not empty, but full of everything that had been said, burned, lost, and somehow returned. The Bowie record sat beside me again, now worn soft around the edges from all the times I'd carried it. I hadn't planned to keep it this long. Maybe I'd thought it was a message to deliver, a promise to return, but somewhere along the way, it had become something else entirely. Not a symbol of what was gone, but of what had survived. I stopped at a diner, just off the interstate, a different one this time. Brighter, newer, with the smell of cinnamon, rolls and fresh coffee spilling out into the parking lot. The waitress, young and wide-eyed, handed me a menu with a smile that reminded me of who I used to be before all the noise. When she came back to take my order, she glanced at the record propped against the window and said, "You into vintage stuff?" Something like that. I said. She grinned. "My dad's got a turntable. Says it's like time travel with sound." I smiled. He's right. As she walked away, I turned the record over in my hands one last time. The surface caught the sunlight, a faint shimmer of color hidden in the black. That's what love had been. I realized not the pain or the fire or even the loss. It was the shimmer, the brief, impossible beauty between the grooves. After breakfast, I walked back to the car and found a small thrift shop next door. A bell jingled as I entered, and an elderly man looked up from behind the counter, looking for something special. He asked. I shook my head. "Actually, I'm here to leave something behind." He nodded like he'd heard that before. I placed the record on the counter and slid it toward him. "For someone else who needs it." He didn't ask why. "Es juste my led," said it Fleerfen, and said he'll find the right person. Outside, the wind had picked up. It carried the scent of the sea even though the coast was miles away. I stood there for a moment, eyes closed, and let it move through me. The air felt different, lighter, cleaner. The kind of air that belongs to people who have finally stopped carrying ghosts. When I got back into the car, the passenger seat was empty again, but it didn't feel hollow. It felt like space room for whatever came next. I started the engine, and the tires hummed against the pavement, a rhythm steady and alive. As the miles stretched out behind me, I whispered into the open air, not for. Imtitim bist, what I said. And here's to what's left. The road curved, sunlight breaking fully through the clouds, gold spilling across the horizon. I rolled the window down, let the wind rush in, and laughed an honest, full sound that belonged only to me. And for the first time, it wasn't about what I'd lost. It was about what I'd finally found. Freedom, quiet. A story that no longer needed selling. And a heart that, at last, had learned how to keep playing without the record. Please paste your script here. I have understood your commands.